Welcome, everyone. My name is Susan Patterson. I'm the director of Through God's Grace Ministry, an organization directed mainly to the Christian faith community to equip them in the fight against human trafficking. The National Black Faith Coalition Against Human Trafficking is one expression of that mission and is produced by a team of pastors and leaders from the Black community who are experts regarding the issue of human trafficking. What they're committed to is to empower the Black church to prevent sex trafficking, serve the needs of victims, and build up the African American family. The people who attended the event that you're about to join felt that the information in this video was one of the most important educational events for anyone working with the Black community to prevent sex trafficking, as it addresses source issues and explains why so many in the Black community are victimized by sex trafficking, both as victims and perpetrators. You can find dates for our upcoming meetings at our website, throughgodsgrace.com. Please do support our work by subscribing to this channel and liking and sharing this video. We begin with Ken Henry's introduction of our speaker, Dr. Brenda Ingram. Let's join the event now.
With this. So without further ado, we're going to get right into this. Let me give you guys a little bit about who she is, because I think it's very, very important that you know who you're giving your time to. Dr. Brenda Ingram is a licensed clinical social worker and an educator who has served over 30 years working in trauma, mental health, and education fields. Her dissertation focused on the impact of community violence on the academic careers of African American elementary school students. She's a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Keck School of Medicine of USC, associate director, student counseling and mental health division, USC Student Health, associate director, USC Student Counseling and Mental Health, and program director, relationships and sexual violence prevention and services at USC Student Health. And Dr. Ingram was a lecturer with UCLA and CSU Long Beach social work departments, and a full-time adjunct professor and member of the Pacific Oaks College Marriage and Family Therapy, where she developed their specialization for African American mental health. She's on the advisory board of the African American Communities Public Health Coalition. She's a member of the National Association of Social Work and National Association of Black Social Workers. She was the co-chair of the Trauma Informed Los Angeles Steering Committee. Dr. Ingram received her doctorate of education from the University of Phoenix, a master's of social work from California State University of Sacramento, and a bachelor's in arts and psychology from UCLA. She provides consultations, program development, workshops, and training on sexual domestic violence, trauma, and trauma-informed care, cultural competency to various human service agencies, schools, mental health professionals. So guys, as you can see, we come here very, very equipped. We are very intentional about who we have presenting and the topics that we talk about. And so without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to this lady so she could bless us today. Dr. Ingram, welcome and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This presentation is on the intersection of risk factors for Black boys as sex traffickers as well as victims. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this is an issue that impacts the Black community in a very, very significant way. And so probably a few years ago, I started talking about sex trafficking. My background, again, as Ken mentioned, is in trauma, and in particular sexual trauma. So I've worked a lot with children who have been victimized and then have been able to sort of watch that developmental trajectory, if you will, into adulthood, and recognize that many of these children who do not receive care at very vital points in their life can end up being trapped in situations that put them at even greater risk. And so what we're going to talk about is that we're going to look at some of these risk factors, because a lot of people don't really talk about boys or Black boys and what happens to them in relationship to sex trafficking. And so for many of you, this may be the first time you've really talked about boys. And again, I think it's important to keep in mind that even though the numbers tell us one thing, we want to look for the backstory. It tells us a whole nother issue. So I'm going to go ahead and start. At least I think I am. Let me just make sure I get down here. Okay. So first I just want to, and again, obviously this is a very knowledgeable group about human trafficking, so I don't need to talk a lot about it, but I do want to make some distinctions. And so, again, we sort of talk about human trafficking as a whole phenomena. But again, human trafficking includes labor trafficking and sex trafficking as well. And so my focus for this particular presentation is going to be on sex trafficking. And again, this impacts every community in our nation as well as around the world. It's an insidious threat. It's difficult for folks to track because, again, it can be so undercover, yet out in broad daylight, if you will. And again, it's very hard to dismantle because there's so many parts attached to it. So again, most people tend to think of human trafficking as being this sort of international phenomena where we have these international criminals targeting victims in developing worlds. And it's important to keep in mind that this is a very common situation here in the US of A. It is not just outside, it is inside as well. And so it's important to keep in mind that this issue of human or sex trafficking can be traced back to the settling of America. It's part of the fabric of America, starting with the colonization of Native peoples, forcing them into different types of servitude or just outright genocide. Also connected to the history of slavery of African Americans, and we'll talk more about that. Also about the exploitation of migrant and immigrant labor that we see. One of the largest types of trafficking is also labor trafficking, where folks are brought in to provide pretty much free labor in terms of household chores, in terms of other types of factories and things of that nature. And so we know that there's different types of this trafficking. And it's all exploitative. And again, it goes back to our history of how we settled in America here. And so again, for sex trafficking, it pretty much started with the selling of indigenous women and children for sexual purposes. And again, this has been going on since the colonial time. There's evidence that the early British surveyors and settlers viewed Native women's sexual and reproductive freedom as a proof of their innate impurity. And that many assume the right to kidnap, rape, and prostitute Native women and girls without consequence. And to this day, Indigenous folks, Native Americans have some of the highest rates of victimization around these issues. A lot of it has to do with how the law is situated. And so most crimes or most violent crimes of a sexual nature happen within communities. The perpetrators look like the victims. When it comes to Indigenous people in America, the victims look very different than the perpetrators. It's one of the places where the vast majority of women and children who are victimized by sexual assault or abuse is done by those who are outside of the community. And that's a phenomenon that we really need to acknowledge. And again, it has to do with how laws are written and that Native communities can't charge folks who are not part of that community or part of that nation. And so it becomes a very feeding grounds or hunting grounds, if you will, for people who are not part of the Native. And so again, this history of exploitation of people of color contributes to the high rate of sexual victimization, sexual trafficking, as well as human trafficking. And so let's talk a little bit about sex trafficking in the Black community. Again, it's a multi-billion-dollar enterprise involving millions and millions of people. And so again, it's important to keep in mind that most victims are females of color. Again, Asian, African, African-American, Latinas. Sex trafficking victims are overwhelmingly female, about 94%, but it's also, we need to keep in mind that a lot of males are also trafficked, especially young men, especially men who are of the LGBTQ community, are exploited. We see that because they end up being sort of thrown away folks. And so they end up being picked up by traffickers. Traffickers live based on vulnerabilities. And the more vulnerabilities someone has, the more likely they're going to be exploited. So again, about 13% of confirmed sex trafficking victims are 25 years of age or older. So that means that a significant number are younger than that. Members of a minority subgroup reported entering prostitution at an age approximately 2.5 years younger than members of the white subgroup. And for African American girls, they enter sex trafficking at a younger age, at about 11, where the average age might be around 13. For African Americans, it's around 11 years of age. And so African American girls are being pulled into sex trafficking at much younger ages. I remember I went on a call when I was an advocate for a rape crisis center, and the young lady that I went to talk to was 11 years old. And she had been trafficked probably for about maybe at least a couple of years. So that means around 9 years of age. And again, she was in foster care. And it wasn't like, someone was holding her against her will in some abandoned house. She was a foster child and she ran away often. She had a pimp, and he kept her imprisoned by drugs and alcohol. And when I came in contact with her, she was in the hospital having been gang raped. And it was a very interesting response at that time. It was before we were really talking about sex trafficking and victims related to that. And so law enforcement was treating this child, and I do mean child, as if she were a grown woman who was making a decision to be a prostitute. And they denigrated her, they treated her less than human. They said she's just out here trying to make some money. And I'm like, how does an 11-year-old end up with that sort of narrative for her life? That she was a victim and that law enforcement did not see her as a victim was very disheartening. And I was so upset by how the officers were responding to her that I had to go and talk to the watch commander, because I thought this was ridiculous that they were treating her as a criminal. And then somewhere along the line that changed, and we can talk about that a little bit later. When the victims were decolorized, all of a sudden we started talking about sex trafficking in a very different way. So it's important to keep in mind that sex trafficking victims, about 83% of them are identified as US citizens. So again, this is not something that's happening somewhere else. It is happening here. And those victims are part of the United States. They are citizens. They are our children. They are our neighbors. They are our nieces. They're everyone that we love and care about. And again, sex trafficking victims are more likely to be African American in terms of compared to their white counterparts. So 40% we're seeing compared to 26% for whites. Most of the confirmed suspects are male. 81% are male, whereas about 19% are female. And so females do participate as traffickers. Usually they themselves have been trafficked and have been in the business, if you will, for a while, and are then sent out as sort of friendly, or at least in quotes, sort of friendly engagers, if you will. And their job is to identify vulnerable girls and bring them back to the sex trafficker and to engage them. And some end up, again, having their own group of girls that they exploit. But a lot of times they are the front folks for males traffickers. We're noticing that gangs are starting to get more involved in human trafficking. It's easier for them in terms versus drug trafficking. It's an ongoing commodity, meaning once you sell the drugs, they're gone. You got to go get more. But with human trafficking, you can use that same victim over and over and over again. And so again, there is a huge influx of gangs getting involved in human trafficking. And another very scary, disheartening, concerning statistic is that more than 60% of confirmed sex trafficking suspects are African American males. So what we're finding is that there's a very, very high percentage of identified sexual trafficking victims that are African American girls. and even also a significantly high number of identified trafficking suspects are African American men. And there are a number of reasons, and we'll talk about why that is. So a study that was done by Los Angeles County Probation Department, just looking at their numbers, found that of 174 underage cases that they looked at, about 84% of those girls were from poor communities. In the southeast communities of Los Angeles County, nearly 60% of them had been in the child welfare system, and 92% were African American. Again, there's many factors in that statement that we will sort of deconstruct in a bit. There are strong connections between trafficking, poverty, migration, gender, racism, and racial discrimination, which again, we will talk a little more in detail about. It's important to keep in mind, as I started this very conversation about trafficking, human trafficking, is that it is part of the fabric of American society. Racism is deeply embedded in human trafficking. This UCLA law review that came out in 2015 goes a lot into detail about the relationship between the discrimination, slavery, racism, and all those issues, and how they have contributed to the to human trafficking, and in particular sex trafficking of people of color. We know that race and racism have played a role in creating this epidemic, and again tends to hinder good interventions, both legally and policy responses, because we don't want to deal with the racism issue of it. We want to go out and rescue folks, but we don't want to deal with the systemic racism or the institutional issues that hold up sex trafficking and benefit many, many people around that. And we also know that colorism can play a part in the Black community around sex trafficking, and that a lot of times, due to how folks feel about themselves, they may engage in different types of high-risk behaviors that that again can be related to their skin color. There was a study that found that persons of color, they looked at Hispanic and African American, expressed forms of maltreatment, emotional maltreatment by their families due to the color of their skin. And so again, the more these traumas, the adverse childhood experiences, the greater vulnerability we create in children, and the greater likelihood that they will be exploited later on. And so this colorism issue, light versus dark skinned individuals, again, they internalize that, and it contributes to their further victimization based on the color of their skin. So again, we want to make sure that we are addressing those issues. And again, those flow directly from issues of racism. So these are some of the key risk factors for child sexual exploitation. And so we're going to talk about different factors in each of these spheres. So societal risk factors, again, not recognizing what this is, not acknowledging sexual exploitation and trafficking, the overall sexualization of children, which is ridiculously rampant right now, the lack of resources, racism, structural violence that happens at a societal level. All of those are issues that have risk factors to create these vulnerabilities for traffickers to exploit later on. And then we have community risk factors, peer pressure, social norms, and we'll talk about some of those examples, gang involvement, under-resourced schools, under-resourced neighborhoods and communities that can no longer protect the residents. And so therefore they put them at greater risk and increase their vulnerabilities, because these communities have been so disinvested in that it is hard for them to, again, protect their members. And so these factors combine together to create these vulnerabilities that set the stage for sex trafficking. We also have these relationship factors where, you know, as was mentioned earlier, families have been disintegrated, if you will, or not provided the resources to protect its members. And so family conflict, disruption, abuse within families. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about adverse childhood experiences that happen in the family that can contribute to sexual exploitation of children. And then we have, again, these individual factors. Any kind of past history of trauma creates a vulnerability in the person. Their own status, are they homeless? Are they throwaway kids? Are they runaway kids? And again, we see that a lot with LGBTQ youth who end up being trafficked. Again, have they been in the system? Have they been in the juvenile system? Again, we see more kids are in foster care. We see more children coming out of those systems that have internalized this sort of negative valuation of themselves that make them more vulnerable to being exploited. And again, stigma and discrimination that they have, again, internalized in their own lives that put them at greater risk for exploitation. So I want to talk a minute about the sexual objectification of Black girls and boys and how it relates to sex trafficking. It's important to step back and sort of look at what are the psychological tools that are utilized in objectifying someone. And this objectification is a very important process of breaking down a person. It's kind of like this brainwashing that you may have heard people talk about. And it's a process of making a person or a group of people the objects of another's group of people or persons. It removes that victim's humanity, allows the oppressor, the abuser, the exploiter, the harmer, however you want to call them, to use them for purposes of self-gratification or servitude. And so you saw this happening with slavery as a prime example of a way that people were objectified. They were told that they had traits that were not human. They were seen as less than. And that's a really important process for both the victim and the victimizer. And it's important to recognize that the system creates and sets up these sort of dynamics that lend themselves to the exploitation. And so when you make someone an object, it's very easy to harm them. It becomes this sort of again, relationship where you have no person, you have no subjectivity, you are not human. And so if you just look back in the history of how many times and ways that happened here in America for African Americans, you know that Black folks and around the world for Black people, that this has allowed them to be exploited, used, victimized, violated in various ways, including just direct violence. And so when we put this into the sexual domain, we look at sexual objectification, and we see this a lot just in terms of looking at for women who are, you know, the sexual being of a woman is used to sell hamburgers, cars, any other kind of commercial product. We are very good at objectifying women in that regards and sexualizing them and sexualizing children. We see a lot of young girls who are put in clothes that should only be put on an adult woman. And even then, I question that. A lot of kids will internalize that and say, well, I want to look like that person that is in the music video that has no clothes on, that's running around, gyrating and doing things of a sexual nature. And we see younger and younger children being sexualized in this way. And this is also true for boys as well, where they contribute their sexuality and become commodities for sale in the marketplace. Boys are told that they need to, you know, have muscles or look a certain way or walk a certain way, that's sexually appealing. And again, we're seeing this happening at younger and younger ages. And so again, American culture has this long history of over-sexualizing Black boys and girls with sexual stereotypes. You know, girls are Jezebels, or we have the hypersexualized Black men, or we have a lot of things around the anatomy of Black men. All of these sort of things that sexualize Black men and can be very confusing if that is not who you are, or again, can be very confusing in terms of how it impacts for males the development of masculinity. And so we have this culture that ends up being internalized and gets displayed in a lot of ways in terms of, even if we're looking at gangster rap, where there's this subculture of glorifying pimps, exploiting girls, misogyny, and things of that nature. And so what we tend to see is this glorification, if you will, of the highly sexualized Black male, which is both, which is a trap. It's a trap because again, men have to live up to that image that's very hard. Um, there are studies that have shown that Black males are portrayed as hypersexual and untrustworthy. 64% of teens feel that media sends this message that it's okay for Black males to cheat in relationships. So all of those sort of messages play a role in the development of a masculine identity that lends itself to sexual exploitation, either as a victim or as a victimizer. And so the sexual exploitation contributes to sexual objectification contributes to sexual exploitation, trafficking, and feelings of traumatization. And so the process of sexualizing, the process of sexually objectifying someone is a traumatizing process. When someone takes your humanity away, when someone takes away who you are, when someone else controls that narrative and the person isn't controlling it, but society is controlling it, it creates a traumatic response in that person. They feel powerless, which is one of the core dynamics related to trauma, is these issues of powerlessness, lack of control. And so again, we want to keep that in mind as we start to look at why we're seeing such high numbers of Blacks involved in sex trafficking. And so we have these risk factors. Again, we talk about it at a societal level, community level, familial level, as well as individual level. And so what we have for Black males is this lack of opportunity. And so because they don't have the same playing field, they have limited economic avenues for mastery and self-esteem, because we are in this systemic racism that automatically cuts off other avenues except the ones that society allows you to excel in. And so capitalism is seen as the hustle, things that we have to do to get by, because we are not allowed to have those regular avenues that are relegated to the privileged, to the dominant culture. We have to either fight through that or come up with other ways. And so you see that for a lot of Black men, they are hustlers. They have to be. It is a survival technique. It is not necessarily a negative thing. It shows ingenuity. It shows industrialness, if you will. And again, it's something to be applauded. But because of racism, you're only allowed so many avenues to do that and to show that. And so again, it becomes the hustle of how am I going to make it in life? And then we have masculinity that holds men accountable for having to provide for their families. In a patriarchal society, if a man is not providing for his family, he is not a man. And then that has assaults on their self-esteem. And so the persona of the pimp is rooted in white supremacist discourse that denied, again, African-American men legitimate venues for economic status. Well, you're not going to be able to be a banker, but you can be a pimp. I remember there was this thing going around for a while where people were doing this sort of 70s party themes, and a lot of people were doing these pimp and hoe parties. I was appalled. I said, there is no way I would ever go to anything like that. And then when I started talking about where that all came from, folks are like, ooh, I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, let's think about it that way. Why are we participating in this? Again, internalized. We have this implicit bias. We are not consciously aware that we are engaging in racist stereotypes, or that we have bought into the racist narrative for African Americans or Black people. Again, America values and prioritizes economic success over other aspects of personhood. So if you are not making big money, then there's something wrong with you. And again, your self-esteem is shot. And so the pimp as a hustler can be regarded as this African-American adaptation to success in America. That becomes who we're looking to. And again, we also see that in the white community as well, in terms of I'm trying to think of the name of the movie now, where they were doing the stock market and how they were exploiting people in that regards. But again, we don't get the same notoriety Those folks are say, oh, they're geniuses. And then we look at folks that are doing the same thing in African, oh, they're criminals. And so again, there's always this sort of um, discourse that makes the narrative around Black folks negative in any way that we can. Also, we need to look at toxic masculinity, sort of the Mac Daddy, super macho gangster type of person, as someone who has a lot of power in the community. And again, this traumatic experiences lends folks to feeling powerless. And so being able to gain that power, we will do that however we can. That is a natural, that's a natural way of being. And so people will go after that. And a lot of times this toxic masculinity that is a product of a patriarchal society sets the stage for misogynistic understanding of women, oppression of women, exploiting women, because again, it's power at any cost. It is success at any cost. And so this sort of capitalism connected with toxic masculinity sets the stage for exploitation. And again, we see this adoption or internalization of the pimp persona with a lot of Black males who end up being sex traffickers, because again, all other avenues of gaining self-esteem have been cut off by the system except these. And we are, again, all of us are driven to excel. That is part of human nature. And so you will do what you need to do in order to survive. And so this rich, powerful, smart, countercultural hero is developed. And those of you who are old enough to remember what have been called now, looking backward, as Black exploitation movies, as you know, a lot of the heroes were pimps or gangsters or people who were making it in spite of, but utilizing criminal avenues to do that. And so, unlike the player whose game was to achieve sexual access to as many women as possible, the pimp's game was to extract as many resources as possible from a girlfriend or for someone else. And again, a clearly exploitative narrative. As Snoop Dogg says, a hoe is done until she is all hoed out. A player can be played out, but pimp is for life. And so that kind of mentality permeates a lot of sex traffickers, and that, I'm going to get mine and I'm better than. And again, you can even hear the misogynistic attitude that is incorporated into that statement. And another thing that happens is that our Black males are over policed. They sneeze and the police are right there, ready to, unfortunately, kill them, shoot them, arrest them. And so one of the reasons why we do have such high numbers of Black males in prison is this over policing, this hyper surveillance. Again, there is high crime in a lot of Black communities that sort of set the stage for that over surveillance, but there's also over surveillance even when there isn't high levels of crime. And that, now we're hearing a lot more conversations around what it means to defund the police and transform police departments so that they're not just so focused on surveilling Black folks. Because again, if you're looking for crime, if you're going to watch Black folks all the time, yeah, you're going to find something. And so again, this need to control this group in ways, I can't tell you how many Black men I've talked to who just talk about how they get pulled over for no reason, how they get over surveilled, how have they entered. For those of you that are not from Los Angeles, LA is seen as a land where there's so much diversity, but there's also a lot of hidden racism, segregation, de facto segregation, if you will, in terms of housing and things of that nature that contribute to, again, this over control, this toxic environment, this creating of trauma in the lives of Black people. And then many times, because of this hyper surveillance or over surveillance, our boys are misidentified as perpetrators and not seen as victims. And again, those who end up in sex trafficking, we need to start understanding their victimhood, and that these are ways that they are trying to survive a lot of the trauma that they have been put upon them at times. And so one of the things that, as we talked about, this is about, I'm using this trauma lens to talk about sex trafficking. There are other ways to talk about it. There's other issues related to it, but I come at it again because my background as a psychotherapist, in particular a child therapist, looks at how trauma impacts the lives of children and then how they grow up and how that trauma impacts all of that. And so understanding trauma is not just about getting the knowledge about what trauma is and what it isn't. It's also about changing the way you view the world. When you understand the impact that trauma has on child development, has on individuals and how they act, you tend to become more compassionate and think about a cause different. And so our problem solving changes when we truly understand trauma. We aren't going out to arrest everyone because they're involved in sex trafficking. Let's try and look at ways that we can provide treatment and support, because again, folks are there due to trauma, due to multiple traumas coming at them in multiple ways, and we'll talk about that. It's about changing the helping paradigm from what is wrong with you to what happened to you. And that's a huge shift, because a lot of times helpers come in, oh, there's something wrong with you, you're not good enough, whatever, let me help you, let me fix you. As opposed to understanding that something happened to this person. There's nothing wrong with them. They were doing fine up until this traumatic event hit them in their lives and knocked them for a loop. And now they're just trying to do the best they can in terms of recovery. And sometimes we do that in healthy ways, and sometimes we do that in unhealthy ways or not as healthy ways. And so we want to look at always asking that question, what happened to you, to help us to understand why we're seeing the behaviors, why we're seeing folks engage in unhealthy or high risk behaviors, as opposed to, oh, that person is just bad or that person is just evil. And again, I understand the context in which I'm here. And so understand what I mean when I'm talking about evil is that I do not believe that anyone is truly evil. I believe that evil things happen to people, and that causes people to respond in ways that are not healthy for them. And then they could engage in some of these acts that are seen as evil as a way of becoming empowered again in their own lives. But I inherently don't see that in my heart of hearts, that there is anybody who is evil. And so we have these adverse childhood experiences that I've sort of mentioned. And these are experiences that happen during childhood that create what we call childhood trauma. And they can be things such as growing up in a home where there's domestic violence, a home where there's untreated mental illness of the parents, or untreated substance abuse, or poverty, or growing up in communities where there's high levels of violence. All of these sort of things, or growing up in a home where you're being abused, either physically, emotionally, or mentally. All of these are issues that contribute to what we talk about in terms of trauma for individuals. Let's see here, let's catch up with myself here on my notes. And so this ACE, what we call the ACE study, was originally done in San Diego through Kaiser. About 17,000 Kaiser patients took part, and they were asked as adults to look back at their lives before they turned 18 to tell if any of these types of events or experiences happened to them. And it was found that more than 60% and almost 70% reported that they had at least one of these sort of adverse childhood experiences. And about 50% reported that they had anywhere from 2 to 3 and even more. And because the Kaiser study wasn't very diverse, it had mostly white, middle class, college educated folks. We wanted to see, well, how does this play out in a more diverse group of folks, either ethnically or class in terms of their social economic status. And so Philadelphia then did an ACE study, but they also looked at not just what happened in the home, but what happened in the community. Were you ever in foster care? Did you ever feel that you were discriminated against? Were you witnessing community violence? And so they looked at those issues and found in their largely ethnic minority community or population, where they looked at a majority of people of color, that the numbers were even higher for ACEs. And so now we know, just based on all the studies that have been done across the country over the past decades, that for African Americans and people of color, that they have higher rates of ACEs. They have higher rates of adversity in childhood. Um, so poverty, racism, neighborhood violence, all compounded the original findings of the ACE study. Again, including more types, bullying, foster care, all of those sort of things contribute, and we see high rates of that in communities that are of color and Black communities in particular. Black adults were more likely to have 4 or more ACEs compared to white adults. And so it was discovered that where you live matters. And again, this has to do with segregation, this sort of de facto segregation, because again, you'll not find it on the books, but it's still on the books in some places in Los Angeles, FYI, where you are not allowed to live because of the color of your skin, or whites were not allowed to sell their homes to people of color, and in particular Black folks. And we have, just hearing more and more about sundown towns where when the sun goes down, you better not be out. And so this sort of relegated people of color, and in particular Black folks, to certain parts of town that were disinvested in, again, compounding the poverty and the lack of power, of powerness, yeah. The lack of being empowered, I guess, would be a better way of putting it. And so your zip code has one of the greatest determinations of your developmental trajectory. So where you live matters. And if you live in a community of color, with poverty, it's going to be a bigger struggle for you than it is if you did not live there. And so there are different types of trauma that I'm going to briefly touch on, just so you can get a sense of all the trauma that impact upon our Black children. So we have historical trauma, which is trauma based on what happened to us in past generations. It is passed down through generations. It is passed down not just through the stories of past abuse, but also embedded in the DNA. So now we know, and again, if you're interested in understanding historical trauma, I would encourage you to look up epigenetics, which is the study of gene expression. And so we know that trauma, because it's such a powerful force in lives, that it will embed itself. And so this is done, these studies, were done with Holocaust survivors who may not have even talked to their grandparents or great-grandparents at this point about their Holocaust stories, but found that they had certain markers in their DNA makeup that held on to these memories of trauma and impacted their lives today. They tended to have higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of depression, and again, without listening to the stories or without even being impacted by parenting from folks who survived. So again, this is why we now know that there is a biological component to trauma. And then there's intergenerational trauma, which is pretty much, again, the same sort of mechanism, in that trauma travels across generations. Historical trauma is focused on groups of people, ethnic groups, cultural groups, whereas intergenerational trauma is about individuals within families. And so we know that these types of traumas, both historical and intergenerational, travel down through generations over and over and over again, unless there's some intervention. It's been stated that trauma will travel up to 8 generations, whereas even alcohol and substance abuse will only go up to about 4 generations. So a very, very powerful factor in terms of development is trauma. And so that's why we are really focusing a lot on the impact of trauma on children, on lives of people. So again, if you grew up in a family where your grandfather committed suicide, you find that there are a lot of members in the family that then use suicide as an approach to solving problems. Again, even if they don't even know about it. We see incarceration that goes across generations. I had one little boy that I was working with, 14-year-old, who thought he was going to be in prison the rest of his life. That was his family story. Everyone in his family, we did a family tree, and pretty much cousins, uncles, aunts, grandparents, parents. His father was incarcerated for life due to murder. And so he felt that this was going to happen to him, and there was nothing that he could do about it. And so we just started to unpack some of that. So all of these sort of situations can be, again, passed on through generations. And then we talk about racial trauma, which again is just starting to get more information about these days, because again, we're looking at racial trauma and its relationship to maternal health and high rates of Black infant mortality. But racial trauma is a term used to describe the physical and psychological symptoms that people of color often experience after exposure to particularly stressful experiences of racism. And so these acts can be both overt and covert, and can again include a lot of psychosomatic, I don't want to say psychosomatic, but physiological responses or biological responses, such as hypervigilance. We see stomach aches, complaints of pain, problem sleeping, self-blame. All of these sort of things are connected to, again, racial trauma. And let me speed up here. I see I'm running behind. And then we also have community trauma, and the impact of this trauma extends beyond just the individuals, but also looks at the community and disempowers the community to protect its residents. And so we need to operate not just at an individual level, you know, as we looked at those spheres of risk factors, but also at a community level. What are we going to do to support that community so it can protect its members, so that it can hold them up and help them to survive and have a better life? Because again, community trauma is real. And so again, all of these different types of traumas come together in a way that we talk about as intersectionality, where all these things meet can create these oppressions that create trauma. So where all these intersections happens tends to be multiple traumas. And again, trauma tends to dominate the lives of people who, if we look at it from an intersectional perspective, because of all their different identities. So if you're a woman, if you are LGBTQ woman, if you are a Black woman, if you are a poor woman, if you are a single mother, if you are a Black man, if you are a Black boy growing up in a poor community, all of these types of identities that you carry come together to create a huge amount of trauma in the lives. We know that trauma can impact Black masculinity, impact any masculinity, but in this case, we're talking about Black. And so there was a recent study that found that Black men tend to develop their masculinity model based on the amount of adversity and trauma they experienced in childhood. So elevated levels of adversity, socioeconomic instability can create these changes in masculinity from a respect-based masculinity, which values characteristics like hard work, education, things of that nature, and replace it with reputational based masculinity. Again, we have to have some kind of masculinity model, and either it's going to be respectful or it's going to be reputation. And reputation is where we're, we the baddest person there. I may not have anything, but I'm bad regardless. I'm self-reliant, I'm aggressive. I engage in sexual promiscuity, again, as a value system for masculinity. And so these are just some of the responses that you might see with African Americans to historical enduring trauma, which is the type of trauma that impacts most of us here in America as Black folks. So we might see an increase in aggression, vigilance, and suspiciousness. So again, this sort of what we would call healthy paranoia. Increased sensitivity to threat. We tend to see threat everywhere. These are the folks that you accidentally bump into them and they want to fight you because you did it intentionally. And so for them, it's about survival. And there's no room in that narrative for accidents. You intentionally did something. And again, it's about survival. And whenever you feel threatened, you're going to do whatever it takes to survive. And so again, it's an important piece to keep in mind as we're working with folks. And then again, this increase in psychological and physiological symptoms, more health-related issues, hypertension, cancer, diabetes, all of these physiological responses to stress and trauma, alcohol use, drug use, a narrowing sense of time, and all of this. And so what we're asking is that we become trauma informed, that we get trauma informed in our communities, that we recognize that trauma is pervasive, that most people have had some trauma in their life. And that we need to acknowledge that we need to say that out loud. I remember I went to a church to do a presentation on the sexual abuse of children, and many of the people in that church, many of the Black men in that church, stood up and said, you know what? It happened to me too. And for many of them, they had never acknowledged that sexual abuse happened. And part of my job was to say, you know, I am sorry that you went through that. Society needs to apologize to victims of this type of trauma and abuse, because we don't acknowledge it. And that makes it even harder for folks to do better. Trauma-informed practices says we're not judgmental. I'm not here to judge you. I understand why you do what you do. I understand the impact that trauma has had on your life. And I am sorry that you've had to go through that. And that we try and understand that human beings always need to feel safe and heard. And that in order to, and for them to do that makes a significant personal change in their lives when they feel safe, when they feel protected. And so even for those Black boys who are identified as sex traffickers, they are victims of a trauma-inducing environment that placed them in that role. Yes, they have responsibility for their behaviors, but I need to understand where that comes from. I need to understand what happened to them so that I can help them in a way that doesn't continue to devalue them, but lifts them up in a way that doesn't blame them, but understands them. And so again, some ways to promote recovery and resilience. We don't blame the victim. We explain how you got there. We help connect the dots. And so as individuals, as churches, as community organizations, as programs, we want to make sure that we don't inadvertently blame the victim for what's going on in their lives. We can hold them accountable. We can help them to understand about taking responsibility, but I am not blaming you. And that's a very important thing. We need to be empathetic. We need to be validating. We need to legitimize their experiences of oppression and trauma. We need to talk about it. We need to provide these spaces for young men and boys to tell their stories, however that works. It could be on a basketball court with men just shooting hoops, talking about, yeah, this is what I went through, building those bonds and attachment. We want to always speak the truth, especially the power about racial, historical, enduring trauma. We don't want to not talk about it. We want to put it out front. And this is the impact of racism, is that it creates racial trauma, that it changes the development of our children. It changes our physiology. It kills us. And we need to start speaking the truth about that. We want to help survivors develop a new meaning about their trauma. How do we help them to repurpose? Everyone has to have a purpose in life. How do you take that trauma history and turn that into your purpose? Okay. We want to teach some coping skills. So again, if you are wanting to start a program around helping boys in general so that they don't end up in this developmental trajectory toward prison or what have you, then let's teach them how to cope with the fact that there's been trauma in their lives. Teach breathing. One of the easiest things to teach that helps to calm the body. We want to talk about movement. You know, we like to dance, we like to move. Include that in our trauma narrative. It's about how we use that. And so you see a lot of boys, a lot of Black children engaging in dance, and that movement creates a shift in the body in terms of trauma. We want to teach problem solving. One of the things that trauma does is disconnects you from the prefrontal cortex of your brain. And so you can't think, you tend to be in a fog most of the time. And so how do we work to do that and empower people around that? We work in collaborations. We are respectful. We give choices. We work to enrich the community. And then we want to make sure that we are supporting the community. What kind of things are we doing in that community to make it a better place? Because ultimately the community is what's going to hold and help heal the individual members of that community. What cultural practices can we use that will help us? What spiritual practices? Again, spirituality is a great way of helping people to find purpose in their lives. How do we help them to embrace that part of it? And then how do we build resilience in our Black boys? Again, resilience is the ability to cope with change. We may not ever do away with racism completely. We definitely want to put a dent in it, a really big dent, but it's always going to be here. And so how do we then build up our community, build up our boys in order to address that? We educate them, we teach them to recognize racism. This is racism. This is not you. This is racism. And we have those conversations that can start. Those conversations can start at about 2.5. Children recognize racism. They don't have the words for it, but they recognize what it feels like. We need to start having those conversations as early as possible and help them to build the skills to have resilience, but also to resist the impact of oppression. So again, remember, activism is the antidote to powerlessness, meaning that we need to get involved. It doesn't mean that we all march down the street with a sign. It might mean that I vote a certain way. It might mean that I reach out to my neighbors. It might mean that I join in activities that are uplifting to the community. It might be that I share my knowledge with folks. Whatever it is you need to do, that's what we do. Because again, as Paulo Freire speaks, the greatest humanistic and historical task of the oppressed is to liberate ourselves. We are going to be the heroes that we are waiting for. And so the more we do to support ourselves around that, the better it's going to be for our children as well as our boys.